Welcome everyone to our International Women's Day event, Dead Feminists. It's the historic heroines, we call it in living color. We were supposed to have the two creators of this, Jessica Spring and Chandler O'Leary. Unfortunately, Jessica is ill, and that does happen, but Jessica, who is the proprietor of Springtime Press and the partner in this, and I hope you're watching, Jessica. I will love to introduce Chandler. I know Jessica and I've known her for years, and this is my first time or my second time meeting Chandler. Is an illustrator and lettering artist. You have a BFA from, RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. This is being brought to you, of course, by the HMCT at Art Center. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Gloria Condrup, and I am the executive director of the HMCT. And I am a printer, for those of you who don't know. But you have a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the other great art schools in the United States. I give you kudos for that. You create your own line of prints and paper goods. You are in Tacoma, Washington. And you also do lettering and illustration work for publications and brands throughout the US. And you have a travel blog where you post your illustrations. Draw the Road Again. You and Jessica, and this is what I learned, just live a few blocks from each other. And that's a great collaboration. So I want to welcome you and thank you for carrying on this wonderful talk. So I'm going to turn this over to you, okay? Thank you again, Chandler, for doing this. I look so forward to seeing how you do this in your process. I'm sure everyone else is. Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to everybody for coming today. And thanks also to Clifford, who is kind of running in the back end here and monitoring the chat. So I appreciate you hosting us today. I'm sorry that Jessica couldn't be here today. She is really under the weather, but she is physically not far away from me. So she is thinking about all of you right now. And hopefully I can do a good job of filling in her part here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with our little presentation. I recognize some names in the participants, so some of you may have seen an iteration of this talk before, but I hope that there will be some new things for you here today as well. And please, yes, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and I'll do my best to answer them. So bear with me here as I still learn to wrangle Zoom all this time later, right? So this is the image that we trot out still. This is quite an old image now, but Jessica and I have been collaborating together on the Dead Feminist series since 2008. And we have a habit of taking pictures of ourselves in front of ladies' rooms, especially those that have good typography, like this one at the University of Washington up in Seattle. So we began collaborating just a few weeks after I moved to Washington in 2008, and I met Jessica in Seattle at Ways Goose, which is a printing celebration, and I found out she lived just blocks from me, and then we started collaborating, and I'll get to our process in just a moment, but I wanted to share a little bit about who we are sort of individually. So I am an illustrator and lettering artist. I have been running a tiny business since 2004. And I recently have been illustrating and writing my own books. So this is an image and some of the original illustrations from my previous book, The Best Coast, which came out a few years ago. And actually last week, my most recent book just came out. So it's called On Island Time, and it's an illustrated travel book about the islands of Washington and British Columbia. It's centered around the Salish Sea, which includes Puget Sound and the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, that part of the world. So this has been what's kind of consuming my time the last few years, and everything is completely hand-drawn, and lettering is a major part of my practice and has been for most of my life, actually. Jessica, on the other hand, is a letterpress printer, and she and I both kind of have some similarities in our background. We both have some roots in the design world and graphic design. I have a little bit of a background in letterpress printing as well, but I always think of Jessica as being a real printer. And she also works with a lot of type and typography, but she is working with hand set metal and wood type. And so this is an example of some of her work here. she loves to take metal type and wood type and really think outside the box about it. And she loves doing interesting typesetting that is non-linear or that is not on a standard grid. She has even invented her own furniture, and furniture is the metal and wood pieces that are used to lock up the type in the press and keep everything nice and tight for printing. She has invented her own type of furniture that she calls Daredevil furniture, which allows the typesetter to set type on angles, on curves, on crazy matrices. It's really a fantastic invention that she came up with, and she has kind of created a side business selling this furniture to other printers. But you can see that she also does this with low-tech furniture as well. You can see that there's some leading in there, there's some cardboard shoved in there. Whatever is necessary to get the finished product, she will do, which I think is really amazing. Some of you may be familiar with what letterpress printing is, but I wanted to show you a little bit of an example here so that you can sort of see what it means. Letterpress printing is a form of relief printing, and relief printing simply means that you are printing from a raised surface. Now, there are other hand print making methods out there, intaglio being a big one that people do. Intaglio is sort of the opposite of relief printing, in which instead of printing from a raised surface, you're actually, in intaglio, you're printing from an engraved surface. So you're pushing ink into a recessed surface and kind of smushing the paper in there. Relief printing is the opposite. You're inking up a raised surface, be it type like this. This is metal type that's set into a matrix that Jessica cut herself with a router, I believe. And you can see the finished print on the left and then the actual type on the right. That could be a linoleum or a woodblock print that has been carved, or it could be photopolymer plates, which is what we use for the Dead Feminist series, and I will get into that shortly. This is Jessica's shop here in Tacoma, Washington. It is less than a mile from my home studio, and you can see in the background of my shot, this is where I am. I'm in my studio, which is a very small space with basically a computer and a desk. And Jessica's space is just this incredible wonderland of her type collection of several different presses. She's got 2 Vandercook presses. She's got a large floor model, Chandler and Price platen press. She has several small platen presses that you can kind of see scattered around the room. She's got a guillotine, a board shear, a perforator, all kinds of equipment that she uses on a regular basis to create her work, and also to collaborate with other artists and occasionally with students as well. It's really an incredible space. If you're ever in the Tacoma area, every year in October, we have an open studio tour circuit that Jessica and I both participate in, and people love coming to her shop. She is one of the big highlights of the tour. So we wanted to share with you today some of our work that ties in a little bit with International Women's Day. And so I wanted to talk a tiny bit about that. This is, on the left here, is our most recent broadside in the Dead Feminist series. And if you're not familiar with the term broadside, it's essentially the great-grandmother of the modern poster. It was an early form of mass communication. It was also an early political form. It was the method, the medium chosen by Martin Luther to bring about the Reformation of the church several hundred years ago. And so it has long ties to political activity, ties to mass communication and design. And nowadays, many artists are using it as a fine art form to spread the word, often about political things. So that's certainly the way we use it. This is our most recent broadside on the left, and it is a broadside about Frances Perkins. And many of you may not be familiar with her name, but you're certainly familiar with her legacy. We have Frances Perkins to thank for such things as the Social Security Administration, for the National Labor Safety Board, or National Labor Relations Board. She was the first female cabinet minister under FDR, starting in the 1930s, and she served for his entire presidential term, and she got a lot done. But she also ties into International Women's Day because National Women's History Month, which is March, began in New York City on March 8th, which is International Women's Day, in 1857, when female textile workers marched in protest of unfair working conditions and unequal rights for women laborers. And so these textile workers are a major catalyst for both the labor rights movement and for the women's rights movement. And so beginning in 1910, March 8th became annually observed as International Women's Day. Now, fast forward 1 year later, and in 1911 was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City. And that has been a huge touchstone for the labor movement and also for the women's rights movement. This was something that directly affected and killed many textile workers, many of whom were women. Many of them were also recent immigrants to the United States. Many of them were Jewish workers and were members of Jewish unions as well. And Frances Perkins was appointed the investigator of this fire shortly after it occurred. And she is the one who looked into the labor conditions, the fact that there were no working elevator. There was only one working elevator at the time. There weren't enough fire escapes. There were locks on the doors. The workers were locked in during the fire to keep them from taking unauthorized breaks. And so that led to many of their deaths. And so in the wake of this incident, she helped pass 60 new labor laws in the state of New York, some of which became templates for national labor laws also under her tenure as labor secretary. So when she went on to serve as FDR Secretary of Labor, she was the one who wrote much of the New Deal legislation, and she enacted many of the alphabet soup agencies that we are familiar with today. And one of the most famous ones is the SSA, or the Social Security Administration. She led to the passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, and she ensured old age benefits for workers, unemployment insurance, aid for mothers and children, and aid for disabled people. And our broadside is called Devotional Labor because Frances Perkins was also extremely religious. And so this act of devotion to her fellow people was a huge part of her personal life as well as her professional life. So we kind of treat her in this piece. The design references her religious life. So she's kind of presented like an icon, like a saint icon that you might see in religious iconography. But also the design references both revolutionary posters, like the famous Russian constructivist poster that you see here on this slide, and propaganda from all kinds of countries. There was wartime propaganda in the US and the UK. There was labor propaganda. There was WPA posters, which was another alphabet soup agency, that themselves, their posters referenced the revolutionary poster designs of the previous decade. So it's all kind of in a family together. So this is kind of what you can expect of our series in The Dead Feminists, that we have lots of layers of meaning, lots of historical references and layers of history, and lots of symbolic things. So we have symbolic titles. We also have symbolic edition numbers. We print a limited edition for each broadside, and each number is symbolic in some way. We began our series in 2008, and it was kind of an accident. We never planned for it to be a series, but the 2008 election was underway and Obama was running for president, and we wanted to create something to commemorate this event. It felt like a historic moment, and we wanted to use our power of the press to say something. And Jessica called me up one day and she said, I have this quote by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she read it to me, and the quote is, "Come, come, my conservative friend, wipe the dew off your spectacles and see the world is moving." And that quote, she was thinking about the spectacles part of the quote, the eyeglasses, and she was thinking about what was happening with Sarah Palin at the time. She was the vice presidential pick for John McCain, and she all anybody wanted to talk about in the media was her looks, her eyewear, her haircut, her appearance, not her politics. People were more obsessed with her being a visible woman out in the public rather than what she had to say or what she believed in. And so Jessica asked me, hey, can you just draw a pair of glasses and I'll stick it in this broadside? And I am really terrible at following art direction. I tend to kind of do my own thing. So I ended up drawing the entire quote by hand. This is all hand lettered. And I sent her something to look at. And she said, oh, okay, we can run with that. She ended up printing it. We made plates of it. We actually made just one plate. It was supposed to be one color. And then Jessica brought out her scissors and cut it up on press. So we turned a one color design into two on the fly. And the series was born. The print was really popular. We sold out right away. We only printed 44 of them in honor of the 44th president. And then we decided to keep going and do some more broadsides. And so over time, we developed some rules of engagement for our series. We ended up, not right away, but pretty soon we came up with the title Dead Feminists, because we wanted to work with quotes from historic women who were dead. So that was a limitation right there. And we didn't want to just talk about feminism directly. We wanted to talk about it obliquely. We wanted to highlight the words and the work of women, but we didn't want each broadside to just be about, well, women are awesome or women can do anything. We wanted it to be about all of humanity through the lens of women's contribution to humanity. So we also wanted to tie each quote that we found, each feminist, into current political and social issues, like we were talking about Sarah Palin and modern politics and the presidential election. So each one takes a historical quote and ties it into whatever's happening in the world right now. And we also wanted the design and the lettering to reference the time period in which the featured feminist lived and worked. So here's a little bit of our process. Even though Jessica works with handset type, we don't generally do handset type for our series. We do have some mini prints, and I'll show you an example in a little bit, that use handset type, but for the most part, all of our broadsides are completely hand-drawn by me. And all the lettering it's original, but it is based on historic type styles, generally from the period of time that each feminist was from. I draw each broadside in pencil initially to work out the design, and then I do the color separations by hand. I ink everything by hand on a separate layer, so I have a nice clean drawing. And you can see in the upper left there, the color separations are drawn on tracing paper. And then I scan each piece into the computer, do a little bit of digital cleanup or clean up any errors I might have, make sure the color separations are tight and are working properly. Then we used to make our own plates. We don't anymore. They've gotten much more complicated and larger, so we send them out now. But we used to make our own plates. We'd have film negatives made so that we get a reverse of the artwork, and then we would make our own plates in Jessica's plate maker. But the important thing is doing the color separations, and this is quite a fiddly part of the process. So if you're not familiar with letterpress printing, every color on a piece is a separate plate, a separate run through the press. So this Eleanor Roosevelt broadside is just two color. It's just the green and the brown, but we had to have two separate plates for that. And lining them up and making sure that they fit together is called registration. And that is one of the trickiest bits about what we do. So here are some color separations that you can see from our Song of Aloha broadside, and I'll show you the whole thing in just a moment. But sometimes we do some really interesting things with color mixing. The inks that we use on the press are generally translucent, which means you can see through them. And so we like to do tricky things where we layer colors to mix into other colors. So this is a 4-color piece. It's technically 5 runs because Jessica did a double hit on that black at the end to make sure it's really punchy. But you can see we ran the yellow first and then the pink over the top of it, but wherever the pink overlaid the yellow, we got orange. So we got 3 colors for the price of 2. Then we printed blue on top of that, kind of a cyan blue. Nowhere on the print does cyan appear alone. We only use it as a color mixing tool. But you can see where it overlaid the pink, we got purple. Where it overlaid the yellow, we got green. Where it overlaid where all 3 were overlaid, we got that kind of brown color. So it was really kind of a fun process. And then at the very end, we had the black hit to tie everything together. It's a little bit of a brain teaser for me to figure out all these separations and make them all work, but it's part of what I love doing for our series. So it's always kind of the fun part for me. So by 2015, we had printed 22 broadsides, and then Sasquatch Books approached us to write a book about the series. And there's 24 broadsides in the book, so we had to kind of print 2 extra broadsides and then sit on them for almost 2 years so that they could come out at the same time as the book. I do have a short video to show you that'll kind of walk you through briefly our process. So we start out with a thumbnail sketch where we kind of work out the conceptual work together. And then I do my pencil drawing, as you've seen before. And that's when I go in after we've kind of figured everything out, and I start inking everything separately. This is the most fiddly part. This is where I tighten up all of the lettering, and this can take hours or days, depending on how complex the piece is, how many color separations there are, how many layers I have to work with, how many layers of tracing paper, that sort of thing. But it depends with each piece how fiddly I get with the pencil drawing. Sometimes my pencil drawing is quite loose, like this one is quite loose, and I kind of did most of the work with ink. Some are quite tight. You can see the color separations on the computer here and our photopolymer plate that we go to print from. Now on the press, each one is a separate run through the press. Each plate is a separate press run, separate color. So here is the yellow pass being run through the press. Here is the black version, the digital version of the orange plate, which is next. And it's unintelligible until they start to come together. So here's that orange plate on the press. You can see Jessica about to line them up. Everything's been very carefully calibrated. We print lots of extras because there's always a bit of a learning curve to get each one really dialed in and really registered properly. Lots of little tiny millimeter moves in any direction. We also mix our own inks, and that is a big part of the process for us. Most of the time when I'm developing a design and an illustration, I have an idea in my head of what I want the colors to be, but it's a different story when you actually get on paper. So we make some changes on the fly. Jessica kind of has some amazing color mixing tricks to get at the right color. She loves to mix metallics in to punch up the opacity. So whenever we don't want colors to mix, if we want them to be as opaque as possible, she'll add a metallic ink in there to punch it up, which is really great. And then we find ourselves testing through drawdowns. This is what a drawdown is. You actually draw the ink down on a piece of paper. We find ourselves constantly testing the colors on the fly while we're printing, and then we make a lot of decisions on press. She's even mixed ink on press before, which is really kind of fun. I love this moment when you add ink to the press. It makes the most satisfying sound. I just love it. But what's really great is that since we live so close to each other and we're both really kind of hands-on types, we can both be really intensely part of every part of the process, even though we kind of have separate jobs on each broadside. So here she is printing the last run of the green, and this is where it all comes together. And this moment of that, aha, it worked, that never gets old. We've been doing this for 15 years. I've been printing at least a little bit for almost 20 years, and Jessica for decades more than that. And this piece never gets old. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. This is the finished piece. This is our Trees of Life broadside, which features the ecofeminist Wangari Maathai, who was Kenyan. And she was the founder of the Greenbelt movement back in the 1970s. And she saw the deforestation that was happening in Kenya and the huge economic and environmental impacts of that, and began that movement to reforest the Kenyan landscape. And she worked with Kenyan women, not only to give them economic opportunities through jobs, but also to reforest that environment. And together, to date, they have planted more than 51 million trees to reforest the environment in Africa. And also, by extension, to fight government corruption and pursue self-governance for the workers there in Africa. So she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, and our broadside references her work, her environment, the species that are affected by these environmental consequences, and also the colors and the vibrancy of the textiles of her region. So, as I mentioned before, we do create some unofficial dead feminists, some mini prints, some big steamroller prints, some public art that we've done together, installations that we have done that are kind of unofficial parts of our series. And this was a mini print that we did in 2020, kind of at the height of the pandemic, where we were talking about just the effects that the pandemic had on women and how women don't forget these things. And we chose Dorothy Parker, who is a writer. She was an author and a screenwriter and a poet. And most people tend to know her for the quote, "What fresh hell is this?" That was Dorothy Parker. She was quite a wit. But interestingly, and less known about her, was that she founded the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. And her work actively fighting white supremacy and fascism led to her being blacklisted and being accused of being a communist, which limited her work opportunities, especially in the screenwriting world. Upon her death in 1967, she left her entire estate, including her rights to her work, to Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, he died a year later. So after his death, his estate, which then included her estate, was left to the NAACP. So the NAACP still benefits from her royalties and her rights today, which I think is an amazing way to pay it forward and leave a lasting legacy that helps people. So we kind of wanted to honor that with this small piece. So we were working with handset type here. There's no lettering involved. It's all handset type, and then I carved a linoleum block. But all of this is still relief printing. It's still under that umbrella of letterpress printing. Through our series, not from the very beginning, but almost, starting in 2010, we started donating a portion of the proceeds of all of our prints and our postcards and our journals to causes that align with the issues that we're talking about with each broadside. And we started with the Washington State Library. We were doing a piece about the Washington Suffrage Association. And women got the vote in Washington in 2010. So 10 years, or I'm sorry, in 1910. So 10 years before women got to vote in national elections, Washington women could vote in the state. So we did our research for that piece at the Washington State Library, and all these amazing librarians were helping us do our research right before they all knew they knew their jobs were being furloughed because of cuts to the library. So we started donating with that piece. We donated to the Library Foundation. And so that became a tradition for us. So with each new broadside, we started making these donations. And because we're a small operation, we work with limited editions. We don't have a ton of money to play with. We're making small donations, micro grants really, but we have a habit of choosing small local organizations that could really make a small grant go a long way. So when our book came out, we started the Dead Feminist Fund. We actually started a foundation to kind of put a little bit more oomph behind our donations. And what was really great was that Sasquatch Books also donated a portion of the proceeds of our royalties in our book to the foundation. So that's all under the auspices of the Greater Tacoma Community Foundation, which is a philanthropic institution here in Tacoma. And we are still making grants today. Every year we choose new nonprofits to support, and it's been a really great way to literally put our money where our mouth is with our series. I wanted to share a little bit about our book. The final cover of the book you can see is on the right, and I wanted to show a little bit of the process behind that. I know there might be some design students watching this presentation, and so I wanted to show a little bit of that process. And in my own work as a studio artist and as a designer, I often don't have the luxury of doing a million iterations of a concept. I kind of have to just get it done, meet the deadline, and live the mantra that done is better than perfect. It's kind of how I have to live my life, for better or worse. But for this book, we ended up doing many, many, many cover iterations. And it's unusual that we even get to do the cover. Even when the author and illustrator are the same person, generally, authors and illustrators don't have much or any control over the design of their books. And so we've been very fortunate to have a very high degree of control over our books. And actually the books that I'm doing now, it's even more so. I'm really involved in the design process. And we got to design the cover of this book, which was also fairly unusual. So we were trying all these different things and doing sketch after sketch after sketch. And I thought, God, I've never done this many iterations before ever in my life. But it just wasn't quite working. We wanted to have these little portraits of the women who are in the book. And so I did these illustrations. We wanted to have hand lettering that dovetailed in with our series, but it just wasn't all working together. And finally, I pulled out an early sketch that I did. I had this little thumbnail of the profile of a woman's face that had kind of gotten rejected early by the publisher. And I took another look at it and I said, hey, would you mind if I develop this and see where it goes? And that ended up actually becoming the final cover of the book that you can see on the right, but it was quite a fraught process to get there. This was one of the broadsides that we sat on for the publication of the book. So we did 2 broadsides that appeared in the book and that were published simultaneously with the book. And we wanted to include this today to talk about International Women's Day, because we have over the years included more and more international women in our series. And so this is Queen Liliuokalani. She was the last monarch and the only queen regnant of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And she was the last one before the monarchy was toppled and colonialism took over in Hawaii. And we chose this piece because of Queen Liliuokalani's life. She is best known in America as being the author of the song Aloha Oi, which she composed bilingually from the start. So it's written in both Native Hawaiian and in English as a way to bridge these 2 cultures that she straddled. But she was deposed by American governmental forces and also by corporate interests, including the Dole Pineapple Company, some coffee plantations, all of these white foreign, essentially, interests that wanted to use Hawaii as this colonial outpost for commerce. And so our broadside is bilingual. So it has the quote, "Be steadfast in the seeking of knowledge," in both English and in Native Hawaiian. That's on her sash there. And behind her portrait in that little sunset there is Iolani Palace, which you'll see in the lower right-hand corner in that photograph. That is actually a glass plate negative that Jessica found in the attic of her house in around 1890 when her house was built. The owner of her house was quite a talented amateur photographer, and he went to Hawaii and shot that photograph of Iolani Palace. And Iolani Palace is where Queen Liliuokalani was placed under house arrest when her reign was deposed. So Jessica had this negative in her house for 100 years before she found it. And so we used that as the basis for part of our design. The other thing about the design, other than the color mixing that I talked about earlier, is the birds and flowers and shell species that are in the insects that are in the design are all either threatened or extinct endemic species in Hawaii that have been interrupted or extinguished by the colonial influence of outsiders. So we wanted to represent the loss of culture and the impact of colonialism on Hawaii. When we came out with our book, we had a launch party at King's Books, which is our local bookstore, and we had a costume party where we encouraged everybody to dress as their favorite historical feminist. We dressed up as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are our favorite heroes to sort of cosplay as, because they were collaborators just like we were. And of course, we will never hold a candle to them, but they collaborated together for over 50 years. And they talked about their collaboration in terms of a marriage. They were married. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married to somebody else and raised a large family with many children, but they saw their collaboration together as a marriage. And Susan B. Anthony was the public face of their collaboration. She was the one who gave the speeches, but it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton who did all the writing. And Susan B. Anthony said that Stanton forged the thunderbolts that she hurled in her speeches. To further honor collaboration, we were asked to write an essay and do a piece about collaboration when our book won a 2018 Pacific Northwest Book Award. So we wrote about collaborating together, and then we did this letterpress broadside with the chapters, the names of each chapter in our book as action verbs. And we talked about our collaborative process through this piece by muddling what each person does. So each word is either hand lettered or hand set with type, same with the borders, and we mixed them all up and didn't tell anybody which was which. So this was kind of a fun project for us. I wanted to share with you one of the chapters in our book. The visual story of our book kind of follows this idea of taking action, working together, collaborating. And so each chapter in the book has a different action word. And it's that action, this idea of action verbs that carries over into our foundation as well. We give action grants to help people make change in their own lives. So our tell chapter, we wanted to highlight women who tell stories in different ways. So we have Virginia Woolf, who was a writer and also a printer. That's not her in the photo in the lower right. That's just another unnamed woman printer. There were a lot of women printers who often were unnamed. But Virginia Woolf saw herself as a printer first and foremost. So she and her husband ran the Hogarth Press in the UK, and it was Virginia Woolf who did the typesetting for the books. And not only did running their own press allow them to publish their own work and the work of others that may not have been picked up by mainstream publishing houses at the time, but Virginia Woolf also saw typesetting and printing as a form of editing, as a powerful writing tool, because she had the literal confines of the printed page, the metal borders of the composing stick in her hand, and the limitations of what you could do with metal type. And she really saw that as a tool to make her a better writer. So she is definitely one of our heroes. Another person that we wanted to highlight in telling her story was Rivka Lipschitz. She is not a very well-known dead feminist. She only came to the world's attention in about 2014 when her wartime diary was found and published. She has a story that is unfortunately similar to Anne Frank. She was a Jewish teenager in Europe during the Holocaust. She was a Holocaust victim, and she was also a diarist. She differs from Anne Frank's story in that, first of all, she was Polish, and she also was extremely religious. So her diary is very religious in nature. She writes a lot about faith and her family, and faith being kind of her guiding light during that dark time. Of course, she did not survive the Holocaust, but she did dream of being a writer, and her words now are on the world stage because her diary was found after the war. So this piece has a quote from that diary: "Although life is difficult, it is also beautiful." And we wanted to reference her dual heritage as Jewish and Polish. So the design references Jewish ceremonial textiles and Polish folk art motifs. And then we also told the story of Sarojini Naidu, who was, her nickname was the Nightingale of India. She was both a poet and a politician, and she interestingly published her poems in English purposefully, because she was a politician at the height of British colonialism in India. And she also saw herself as someone who wanted to bridge these cultures together and make a better life for her fellow countrymen through the power of the written word. So her this broadside references her the imagery of her poetry, also the Mendi tattoo, henna tattoo imagery that is common in India, and we also got into some technical stuff on press where we did a rainbow roll, which is where we mixed multiple colors at once on the press. So you can see Jessica's applying ink to the oscillating roller on her Vandercook, and that roller goes back and forth as it spins, so it distributes the ink, and so you kind of have to work quickly, or else those colors are going to mix and blur into one. But you get some really interesting rainbow effects while you're working on it. After our book came out in October of 2016, so right before the 2016 presidential election. We were among many who were optimistic that we would have the first woman president at that point. That is not what happened. And so after the book came out, we kind of hit this crossroads of, do we continue the series? What do we do? So what we ended up doing was marching with everybody else in the streets in 2017, and we decided to keep going with our series. But our series really changed after this point. Our broadsides became angrier, they became more strident, less veiled, and we stopped pulling the punches at this point. So this is one that we did in 2018. This was before Roe v. Wade was repealed, was overturned by the Supreme Court, but we did this during the confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and after we heard Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's powerful testimony and how it got her absolutely nowhere. And so we featured a quote by Simone de Beauvoir, who was a French author. And in 1971, Simone de Beauvoir published a manifesto called the Manifesto of the 343, which she ran in a magazine in France. And 343 women signed their names admitting to having had illegal abortions and thus risking arrest, but they came forward publicly. A year later, a similar Ms. Magazine in the United States did something similar out of inspiration from that. And then a year after that, Roe v. Wade, that decision was handed down in the United States and abortion became legal. So this piece is about abortion, obviously. We did this piece while I was pregnant with my son, and my son, who was very much wanted. This was very much a wanted pregnancy, but this was very much on my mind at the time. And we did this piece to talk about what is the worth of a woman's testimony. And as we watched what happened to Dr. Ford, very little, even in this day, 50 years after what Simone de Beauvoir was doing in France, a woman's testimony is still basically worthless. How many women does it take to come forward before our stories are believed, before something will change? So here we are, we're still fighting this fight all this time later. We also, in 2017, we did a piece about Frida Kahlo, and the quote here is, "Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly?" And at this time, this piece is entitled Estados Divididos, which is a play on Estados Unidos. The United States is the Estados Unidos in Spanish, which means just that, United States, but we are in a very divided country right now. And Frida Kahlo in the 1930s followed her husband to the United States to be here with him while he painted a mural commissioned by one of the Rockefellers. That mural was destroyed because he put a portrait of Lenin in it and he wouldn't change it. But she was in Detroit while he was working on that, and she absolutely hated it there. She saw America as this industrial capitalist wasteland, and she longed to go back home to Mexico, to her family, and to the natural world there, and to what she saw as paradise. And so it was kind of this flipping on its head of how modern Americans often see Latin America. They see it as this place that everybody's trying to flee from, but she saw it as paradise. And so we created this divided state in this broadside of this white supremacist no man's land forming the border, and Frida Kahlo's world being this beautiful clear sky on one side, and then America being this awful Hieronymus Bosch-like hellscape of what is being done to Latinos, people selling out their neighbors, families being separated, people being held in camps. And actually at the time in 2017, most of this stuff was not yet made public. Most of this was an illustration of our fears about what would happen. And I remember thinking at the time, people are going to think I'm being hysterical. People are going to think I'm being overly dramatic. But as it turned out, all of these things happened and more. So we also referenced, in the lower right corner, we referenced Frida Kahlo's painting, What the Water Gave to Me, from 1938. And it's a very Hieronymus Bosch-like look at her personal life. This was also the very first Frida Kahlo painting I ever saw when I was a teenager. So I wanted to reference that. And finally, the last broadside that I'll show you is our Ida B. Wells broadside. This was our 30th broadside. The title is Truth or Consequences, and we did this in 2020. Because our series began with a suffragist, we wanted to do another suffragist for our 30th broadside, and we wanted to do a Black suffragist, because one of the problems with having Elizabeth Cady Stanton as our first dead feminist was that she employed a lot of racist rhetoric in her fight to gain the vote for women, and that was really problematic. And a lot of our feminists, Simone de Beauvoir was problematic, Alice Paul was problematic. A lot of our feminists have these problematic histories and these views that we wouldn't necessarily agree with today. So we wanted to talk about suffragists from the Black perspective, and also to talk about intersectional feminism. And the term intersectionality was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. And to talk about this idea of fighting for a right or fighting for a freedom on more than one front at the same time, caring about and fighting for more than one issue simultaneously. And I think Dr. Crenshaw would argue, and certainly I think Ida B. Wells would argue, that not only can you fight on more than one front at the same time, but you must. And so this is what we were talking about with this piece. The quote is, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." And what Ida B. Wells was doing in her life was, she was a suffragist. She was fighting for women's suffrage. She was starting women's clubs. The women's club movement was a major vehicle for women to gain the vote and to further other political causes. But Ida B. Wells and her Black compatriots were sidelined by the white suffragist movement. They were not allowed to march with the marches, or if they did, they had to force their way in. They were not welcome at the national suffrage meetings. And so she was fighting on that front. And at the same time, she was devoting her entire investigative journalism career to exposing and documenting the practice of lynching, which primarily affected Black men in America, although not entirely. There were women who were lynched, there were non-Black men who were lynched. But it was Ida B. Wells's research and data that is still used today as one of the major primary sources for this history of Jim Crow and lynching in the United States. So with our design, it's like all the others, it's all hand lettered, and we are using symbolic colors here. We have red, white, and blue for America, and also the red and blue symbolizing the two major parties in our political system. And together, if you mix red and blue together, you get purple, which was the major color symbolizing the suffrage movement. That was their main color. But in this design, the design is illegible without the intersection of the two colors. So it's only a two-color print. We printed the red on top of the blue, and you can only read the quote because of the intersection of those two colors. And it was really important to us to have that process. So I'll leave you with this diptych of images here. We're still inspired by women who stand up to authority. We have women in 1913 standing outside the White House demanding the vote. And then we have women protesting the death of Alton Sterling at the hands of the police in Baton Rouge 100 years later. And we are still fighting this fight. These other women are still fighting this fight, and we hope to continue to be inspired by them today on International Women's Day. You can learn more about our series here at our links. These are our Instagram handles separately and together, and you can learn more on our website as well. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, but I'm going to thank you all for being here for my presentation.
Thank you. I mean, you did Jessica. You did her well, but I want to thank you. What a fabulous presentation about, I was unexpected. I'm glad I didn't watch it beforehand. And if you have any questions, please put it in the chat room. I already see there's one question that came in rather early, and I was curious about this too, was, you know, your broadsides sell out so quickly. Mm. And I know you have subscribers too. Did you ever think about selling some of the fee level broadsides, the ones that didn't quite make the cut? I'm sure there are people who would love to contribute to your fund and buy those. Have you ever considered putting together
we have kind of a complicated system for that. So we do have some sort of B prints that we do sell. There, we label them APs, or artist proofs. And those are generally good enough to make it to be sold, but they were extra prints. We kind of print extra anyway because you saw our registration system is kind of crazy. But we do have some artist proofs that we sell. There's still only so many of those. We have the really bad prints we turn into little mini journals that Jessica named lemonade journals, because when life hands you lemons, you make lemonade. So the 100% of the portion of those go towards the fund. And then we have the reproduction postcards, which is kind of our compromise on the reprinting issue. We have only reprinted an edition one time ever, and that was in 2020. We did a Ruth Bader Ginsburg broadside, and
right.
we printed our largest edition to date of that, and it's sold out in like 8 hours, I think, the entire edition. So a lot of people didn't get one. And people were emailing us like, I always get one on the day that it comes out and I didn't get one. And so we ended up kind of compromising a little bit. We did a second edition for that. We did it in a different color. We're still pretty passionate about not devaluing our editions by doing open editions. But so yeah, we're trying to ride that line between limited edition and democratic multiples and affordable art. So yeah, it's not perfect, but we're trying.
So are you working on the next broadside?
We are. We're still trying to find a quote. Jessica found, this is a little bit nebulous because it's not one dead feminist per se, but it's kind of an entire feminist culture that is at risk of dying out. We were looking at the Korean divers. So they are deep sea divers from Korea who dive without equipment for seafood. And they're all women. The average age of these women is over 65. A lot of them have passed on now. It's this incredible culture, but we have not found a quote yet. So that's kind of what we're working on. We also,
well, maybe if there's someone out there who can help,
yeah,
the audience, you might have reference.
Yeah, I would be grateful for that. We also have been thinking, it's early, but Judith Heumann just passed away this week. She was a disability activist, an incredible.
Yes. Her activism was what created the ADA.
Yeah. And actually
laws,
we had a very, very slight brush with her. We got to design and curate the Women's Suffrage Centennial exhibition at our State History Museum. And we had this big wall of portraits of living women who are major influencers. And we contacted her for her permission to use her photo. And she was very gracious and got back to us immediately. And that was just this tiny little brush with her, but it was like this starstruck moment for us. So we've been thinking about her a lot too. So she may be a possibility as well.
So if there's any, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I was looking at your book and I just happened to notice that everyone who was involved in the production of the book, the editor, production editor, design, illustration, and lettering, and sheets copy, were they all women too?
They were all women. In fact, at Sasquatch Books, it may be a little different now, but at the time, the founder of the company is a man, and there was one designer who was a man, and everybody else was a woman. So it's this incredible women-run company.
Right, and I give you a lot of kudos to that. I know we have done projects too where we try to look at the complete thread of what we do. Is it's interesting. The concept of collaboration. Do you think it's easy? It's easier for women to collaborate in an environment, or do you think it's not an issue, a gender issue?
I've never really thought about that, but I think you may be right. I think we may be more used to collaborating. I think we may be more used to checking our egos at the door. I think we may be more expected to collaborate and the bigger person. But I know that it's also, there's kind of a magic secret sauce in there. And I have done lots of collaborations with other artists, and Jessica even more so than I have. And some work better than others. I mean, sometimes it works great and sometimes it doesn't work great. And there's everything in between. And I think the fact that Jessica and I are both women and we can complain to each other about stuff is really, and kind of whenever we face some sort of discrimination or just kind of squishy, icky stuff, having that other person also know that experience is really helpful. So I think that might be a piece of it. I've collaborated a little bit with men, but not a ton. And that's not to say I don't want to collaborate with men. I just, it's what I'm experienced with.
Well, I want to thank you as we come to the close of our hour. I have some projects in my little brain that will involve you and Jessica, which I'm not going to go into it with the audience.
Okay.
But I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you so much for doing this. And I really, really am so amazed and appreciative of the work that you're both doing. And I think it's beyond just pretty pictures. It is about history. It's about contribution, and not just as women, but I mean, this is what our people should be learning, beyond the beautiful work that you do, beyond the fact that you inspire, hopefully our design students to do research, to look at what was the aesthetic of what you're producing. These broadsides are heavily researched. And I encourage everyone to buy the book. Right. I hope it's still in print. I hope I'm not encouraging people
it is
to
still in print.
Thank you. And they can get it, I assume, at your local bookstore.
And
is it available through the fund, through the foundation?
We have it available on our website, in our web shop. We have copies there. Then they can also order signed copies through King's Books, which is our local website. Or it wouldn't be a signed copy, but they can also they can order through their local bookshop as well.
Great. And I think that's a key point. Order through your local bookstore. Don't order directly from the fund. Don't go to the big sellers that we all know.
The publisher always tells us to be, retailer neutral. So I'm not going to knock any large retailers, and they have, played their role in this. But yeah, if you can support your favorite local bookshop, that is so much better. So much better.
And I want to end on this. Thank you, Andrea, for saying your project is a brilliant example of art and mission philanthropy. Thank you again. Thank you, Andrea, for that wonderful quote. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you everyone for coming to the presentation. This was a very inspirational talk. Your work is wonderful, and I will be there for your Waves Fuse now.
Yay! Oh,
in
that's
October. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.